Greetings, everyone, and a warm welcome to this half-day event on racial profiling and policing. I know that there are folks who are coming into the waiting room and entering the conference as we speak, but I did want to take this moment to warmly welcome you here and to thank you for your participation and your engagement. We've been somewhat overwhelmed by the discourse and the interest in this event. We've had a significant number of speakers who have joined us today and a very large number of people who have registered for this conference. We're absolutely thrilled that you are all here. So I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement, a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you from Montreal, from Jojage, the home of McGill University and the Max Bell School of Public Policy, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. And this is a place that has long served as the site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. We recognize and respect the Kanien'kehá:ka as the traditional custodians of the land and the waters on which we meet today. At the Max Bell School over the last year in particular, as the discourse on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and what all those words mean, has come into sharp focus, particularly in the last several months, we recognize that public policy has fallen short in many respects in combating systemic oppression. When I started this event with the land acknowledgement, I was not merely making a ritualistic acknowledgement that one often finds at the beginning of sessions simply to do the acknowledgement, although of course the acknowledgement is extremely important. I'm also making it because it is impossible to have the discourse about racial profiling without acknowledging the long history of racial profiling, discrimination against Indigenous peoples in this country. Starting from the earliest practices through to the notorious Starlight tours, where law enforcement officials, including the RCMP, would pick up Indigenous peoples in the winter and relocate them, often with lethal consequences, outside during the winter. The targeting of Indigenous families, the 60s scoop, residential schools, all of these situations where law enforcement officials directly or indirectly were engaged in profiling, identifying, and discriminating against Indigenous peoples. We know that careful and long-term research has told us that discriminatory profiles and the stereotypes underpinning them have long been a part of our society. And yet there is no national law or standard in Canadian policing that prohibits random stops and similar practices that lie at the core of police racial profiling everywhere, and that has been at the heart of so much tragedy for so many peoples, and especially for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. For this reason, we have decided to explicitly ground this conference in the language and the concepts of racial profiling. And we do this so as not to dilute the discussion and the dialogue because of intersectional factors which, while important, cannot and should not be used to whiten the spaces in which intersectional work is taking place, if I may borrow the phrase from the literature. And I would like to take this moment to express deep gratitude to my colleagues in this conference who have helped guide us and raise our own consciousness on these issues. The online conference brings together speakers with expertise and personal experience to discuss innovative policy solutions, to find effective strategies to end all forms of racial discrimination and racial profiling, which are illegal practices. As a lawyer, I've known this for a long time. In practice, the practice has been quite different. The guiding principle in organizing this conference has been that we need the voices, the presence, and the advocacy of those who have experienced racial profiling, and I'm thrilled to have those folks with us today, of academics and scholars who can deepen our understanding of the phenomenon of racial profiling, of human rights institutions that have brought us many of the definitions and working concepts that we have with us today, and the police, whose practices are at the heart of the issue, but also need to be part of the solution. And of course, community organizers. With that focus in mind, we are deeply privileged to have with us to co-open the conference today the Honorable Marlene Jennings. Ms. Jennings is the president of the Quebec Community Groups Network, a retired lawyer, a former member of parliament, and a valued contributor in Quebec's English-speaking community. She currently sits on the Ministry of Public Safety and Comité Consultatif sur la Réalité Policière that has conducted private and public consultations, including public forums, as part of a bigger effort to modernize Quebec's police forces on the basis of modernity, efficiency, and trust. And Marlene, if I may, your presence today has special meaning for me. Marlene was a political leader in Montreal in an area that I grew up in. Her name was part of the landscape, part of who we were, and part of our advocacy at the federal level. And to see a minority woman and a lawyer climb to the heights of political, social, and personal leadership has been an inspiration for me and to me long before she ever knew who I was. Marlene, welcome, and I open the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Pearl. I'm honored and a little shy after that introduction. I don't have prepared notes. When Pearl asked me to open this conference, I thought about racial profiling and my own experience, both personal but also professional. And it took me right back to on the professional level when I was the first woman and the first person of color, first Black person to be appointed to the then Quebec Police Commission that had existed since 1969, and I was appointed in 1988 to that commission. So it had gone quite a long time, all white, all male, all francophone. And we received a complaint from a young man living in LaSalle who was of Indian origin from the state of India, the country India, of that origin. And he had been stopped by the police in front of his home. And when he refused to identify himself because he had not been given a legal reason why he had been stopped and why his identity was required, he was actually roughed up quite badly. He filed a complaint. I was one of the 3-member committee that heard the complaint. When it came to, and I was the presiding member, when it came to, after hearing all of the evidence, interrogating the police officer involved, interrogating the young man, you name it, was time to make a decision. And my decision, and I was the one writing the decision, was that he had been a victim of racial discrimination. Back in 1990, the word racial profiling, that term was not common the way it is now and not acknowledged. The 2 other members dissented. Speed forward. Quebec Police Commission is abolished. The system of a uniform code of ethics for the police officers across Quebec is put into place. An independent system to treat and handle and investigate such complaints is also put into place, and I'm appointed Deputy Commissioner for Police Ethics for the province of Quebec. Nothing in the law talked about how to get the information of this new law, how it operated, what the rights were, what the code was. There was nothing in the law about that. I took it upon myself to reach out to community organizations that provided services to communities, whether it was the Black community, the Filipino, the Chinese community, the Greek community, Italian, you name it. CRAR was one of the organizations that I reached out to, and happily CRAR also worked with me. And I held all kinds of meetings on my own time, evenings, weekends, to reach out to these community organizations, to tell them about the new system, tell them about how they could accompany a complainant. When I left, that whole process fell. Why? Because it wasn't legally mandated. So for me to participate today and for a university of such international renown to undertake to have a conference on racial profiling and to invite all sectors, academic, researchers, the police, community activists, ordinary citizens, and open it up to everyone to be able to listen, learn, and exchange on it, to me, that's a major, major step forward. It was something that nobody could have imagined back in 1990 or even in 1997. Because 1997, when I left and went into politics, that's when the term racial profiling and acknowledgement of systemic racism and institutionalized systemic racism just began to be talked about, investigated, researched. Today, everybody acknowledges systemic racism is a reality here in Canada, including Quebec. Everybody acknowledges that there is systemic racial discrimination that has been institutionalized. Everyone, unfortunately, except the government of Quebec. And with that, I hope members of the government of Quebec, public servants, are part of this conference, are listening with their ears open and actually learn something so that when you go back to your department and you speak with your superior, whether that superior is a director or an assistant deputy minister or the deputy minister or the minister, him or herself, that you will be talking about, yes, there is systemic racism in Quebec. And yes, it has been institutionalized. And we need to be aware of that when we develop policies and practices, and the government has to acknowledge it. Thank you. Have a great conference.
Thank you so much, Marlene, and we're looking forward to your leadership in the second panel. Very briefly, before we move to panel one and to Phoniemi, who you just heard referenced by Marlene, I just want to respond quickly to one of the questions that we had come in. What do you mean by racial profiling? What are we calling it? I'm going to use the definition that comes from the Supreme Court of Canada's 2015 decision in the Bombardier case. Racial profiling is any action taken by one or more persons in authority for reasons of safety, security, or public order that is based on actual or presumed membership in a group defined by race, color, ethnic, or national origin or religion without factual grounds or reasonable suspicion that results in the person or group being exposed to differential treatment or scrutiny. And I would like to underscore that that definition came directly from the work done by the Quebec Human Rights and Youth Rights Commission, and we're thrilled to have with us Philippe-André Tessier, who is currently the president of that commission. So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Phoniemi, the Executive Director of the Center for Research Action on Race Relations, a Montreal based nonprofit that engages actively since the mid-80s in public education, training, and assistance for victims of racial and other forms of discrimination. He's a graduate of McGill and Concordia with extensive experience, including community development training on systemic discrimination, racial bias, racial profiling, assistance and support to victims of discrimination, civil rights litigation, and mediation. Apparently, this is not enough in his full-time job, so Fo also has served as the chair of the Montreal Urban Community Trust Transit's Complaints and Examination Committee, commissioner with the Quebec Human Rights Commission until 2003, and chaired public hearings in 1983 on discrimination and violence against the LGBTQ community, leading to major changes in health services. He's also served as an advisory committee member at the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police and the RCMP, the board of directors of the Court Challenges programs, and multiple other organizations and institutions, including the Quebec government's task force on racial profiling. And before I turn it over to Fo, thank you very much for your presence today. It is simply impossible to have a sustained or meaningful conversation in this city and in this province without encountering Foniemi's work, his influence, and his legacy, which is something that is been influential both with regard to the protection of victims and the development of meaningful standards to protect the people in this province. And Fo, we are thrilled to have you with us today and have a good panel.
Thank you very much, Pearl. Merci beaucoup, Pearl. Merci de m'avoir confié cette tâche aujourd'hui. Je voudrais juste saluer tous les participants, tant francophones qu'anglophones, à travers le pays. I would like to thank you and acknowledge the fact that also we're in the land of the First Peoples, the First Nations. I can't name one single nation because I know that we're so diverse from coast to coast. So I would like to acknowledge all of that and also that reality. And also I want to ensure that in our discussion and all of action, we're committed to the principle of truth and reconciliation, because I believe land acknowledgement without a commitment to truth and reconciliation in our daily action, I think we need that. J'aimerais peut-être vous parler un peu du fait que si vous voulez me poser des questions vers les interventions françaises, I can translate it for you. I welcome Francophone participants. I also want to take this opportunity because some people seems to have saluted me, and I want to salute Michel Turenne, who is worked with me on the task force on racial profiling back in 2003, and whose dedicated work led to the definition of racial profiling for the life we work with, and we walk alongside well, it is really the gender issue, because in all the discussion, we have to remember that racial profiling and racism impact women of color very, very differently, and often that's a neglected part. There are also bilingual, if not English-speaking Quebecers, and that's also a major factor in access to justice in Quebec, in Montreal, for victim of racial profiling, which I hope we have some time to get into. So without any further due delay, I'm very honored to be part of the two people whom I worked with in the last decade, especially with Joel. Like, I spent practically 11 years with him, and with my colleague, Amar Misakila, who basically played a key role in Joel's fight against racial profiling before the municipal court, before the Superior Court, and before the Human Rights Tribunal. And I would like to also recognize my colleague, René Saint-Léger, who was in 2003, which just launched the major intervention in Saint-Michel against racial and the residents of public housing who are Black. So, Joelle, would you like to take us through the decade of your fight in 10 minutes as to what you have gone through, both through the human rights system, the police ethics system, and the regular court system in fighting tickets and abuse of police powers?
Absolutely. Thank you, Fo. Hi, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank all the organizers for putting on such an incredible event of racial profiling awareness. We've got some great speakers here. All are well-informed and the right people to help create change. Over the course of the last year, all of us have had to face extreme pressure, reinventing the wheel, so to speak, and how we've had to live and cope in our everyday lives. Definitely not easy, but I commend all of you for doing what we all hope and anticipate to achieve in life, which is to live unscathed and free. In reference to that, I'm certain all of you have endured at some point in your life an unwanted feeling of stress and uneasiness that was not justified based on your actions. I get it. It's not easy to talk about or to face that elephant in the room. Many people here and hate to talk about. However, this is why we're here. I'm Joel de Belfay, and this is my story. I received my driver's license at the age of 25 and was given a car by my mother in 2001, a Subaru Legacy to be exact. I drove that car for about a year or so, then I traded it in for a dark blue Volkswagen Jetta. I loved that car. It was pretty decked out, tinted rear windows, mags, the works. In 2003, I swapped it in for my first BMW. a black four-door 1998 328i. That car was fast. I got a ticket after 2 days of just having it for going 83 in a 50 zone on St. John's Boulevard in the West Island. That was the last ticket I received before I moved to the South Shore of Montreal in June of 2008. In July of 2009, my wife, stepdaughter, and niece, and their friend decided to go fishing down by the water. On our way back, we decided to stop for some ice cream. We were followed by a police car and pulled over. No tickets were given at the time of the stop, but only 3 months later when a bailiff showed up at the door. One was for failing to produce ID to a peace officer, and the other for lapsed car insurance. We decided to fight the ticket, and on June 1st, 2010, I knew I had been racially profiled. The officer had written on the police report that the name de Belfay sounds like a Quebecois name and not the last name of a Black person or any of the origin but Quebecois. I won that case, having gone back and forth to court with both officers receiving 5-day suspensions without pay. It set case law and jurisprudence, as it was one of the very first cases in Quebec where a judge had mentioned the words racial profiling in a 66-page decision. In 2012, we were bringing my son to daycare and were followed by 2 officers, one white and the other Black. They never put on their lights or sirens, but confronted me as I left the daycare. They wanted to see my ID because they were doing a random verification. I said, if it were so random, how come you didn't pull me over 2 kilometers back? It was actually 11 blocks and 1.4 kilometers. In 2015 at 9:30 at night, I was pulled over. I was sure I was being racially profiled. I questioned their motive for stopping me immediately, and they told me I was not wearing my seatbelt. I'm that person you hate. The moment you get into the car with me and before the car is even started, I ask everyone if they have their seatbelts on. So definitely, I knew that was false. We decided to fight that ticket too. I was scheduled 5 times to go to court, went to court, but then later told by the Crown prosecutor that the officer was sick, on vacation, etc. Each and every time there were quote unquote excuses for not showing up. On the 5th time, the prosecutor told the judge they were dropping the charges due to the Jordan law, where it had surpassed the 18-month time limitation. On November 17th, 2020, I received some great news. The Human Rights Tribunal had ruled in my favor over the 2012 incident where the officers were simply doing a random verification while driving my son to daycare. The judge clearly ruled I had been the victim of racial profiling and reprimanded the city of Longueuil and its police force to create an action plan on racial profiling, train their officers, and to regularly collect race-related data on all police interceptions where a visible minority is involved, as well as a $12,000 monetary compensation. This ruling is the first of its kind in Quebec, and I believe Canada, where a court has handed down such a decision, forcing a police force to basically rewrite some of their procedures and policies. It's a landmark decision that will have a rippling effect straight across the province of Quebec in Canada, where police forces and government bodies are forced towards this rule of change. Not only is this type of info gathering crucial towards the fight against racial profiling and discrimination, but also towards educating those in authority that at the end of the day, we all bleed the same color and we're all faced with the same fate. And it doesn't matter what car you drive, how long your dreadlocks are, how big your afro is, or what type of clothes you wear, or how you eat, sleep, and speak. You are who you are, and that is the only thing that matters. Racial profiling is wrong. It hurts you mentally, emotionally, and financially. And all of us have much better things to do in life besides judging others based off of their appearance. In regards to hurting people financially, I don't think people are quite aware that this type of practice by police will haunt them for a very long time. On multiple occasions, I've been charged double for car insurance just because I've had pending tickets while calling to get a new insurance quote from a broker. If you have tickets that you believe were based solely on racial profiling, but you've yet to prove it in court, those tickets will hurt you and will affect your car insurance premium. The insurance company gathers their information from the SAC and check for tickets and loss of points. They have told me when I asked them point blank, if these tickets were not on file, would my insurance quote be lower? And they flat out said, yes. Please call us back and provide us with a copy of your driving record showing that the tickets were removed, and we will get you a better rate. But how can you do that when the whole court process takes an average of 3 years and up? The police do not care or think about the possible long-term repercussions of racially profiling people. They care about meeting their quotas and finding out who's behind the wheel. It's time for the government to recognize that systemic racism and discrimination is an ever-increasing problem in this province and Canada-wide, and they need to address it and look to correct it as soon as possible. For one, our very own Premier of Quebec, Mr. Legault, says it doesn't exist or isn't widespread across the province enough to recognize it as a problem where we need to call it systemic. Montreal's very own police chief, Sylvain Caron, even recognizes that there is an issue of systemic racism and discrimination, and I quote, however, this contribution cannot be complete without recognizing the societal issue of systemic racism. I therefore recognize that social inequalities can be linked to systemic discrimination, which can be observed in every sphere of our society, in every institution and organization, including the SPVM. Montreal's Mayor, Valérie Plante, recognizes there's a problem with systemic racism and discrimination. And I quote, I welcome the long-awaited report of the Office de Consultation Publique de Montréal report on systemic racism and discrimination. Already, my administration is making commitments that we will act on quickly to address the 38 recommendations in the report. The mayor of one of Canada's best-known metropolis is standing behind evidence proven by a third-party organization to help the city defeat this evil beast we call racial profiling. The police chief of Canada's best-known metropolis is standing behind evidence proven by a third-party organization to help the city defeat this evil beast we call racial profiling. What proof do we need to prove it's an issue? Do we need to pressure the government to cut down salaries of those who continue to use this illegal practice? Do we need to pressure them to increase training to ensure they weed out the bad apples? I, for one, do not think that 5 days suspension without pay is a legitimate enough reprimand for someone belittling and humiliating someone based off of their skin color when those people of authority are supposed to be there to help us. I just pray that the future is brighter for my son and his generation, and for those who have children that are just a few years away from experiencing this god-awful practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel. It's a very, very important sort of review of a decade of fighting not only racial profiling, but other forms of racial discrimination as well. I would like to invite now Majiza Philip to tell a story because of time. I just want to mention that I'm also very, very privileged to have worked with and supported Majiza over the years. And we've gone through several legal channels in order to fight the battle. Actually, her case is not only about profiling, but there's also a dimension of racial profiling. It's very, very important. Is that link between race and excessive force, especially excessive force used by the police on the women? And that this is one of the issues that has to be explored in greater details in Canada, because we are just faced with just too many cases of this kind. So Majiza, would you like to tell your story?
Before Majiza, just before you jump in, I had promised that I would step in and just briefly describe what happened to you so that you would not be in the position of having to do that. So please forgive my intervention. Please forgive my intervention, Fo. I just, for many of you who are not in Montreal may not know the story, but even if you do, it's been several years, and I think it's important for us to remember what the facts were, and also to reiterate that once again, CRAR Foniemi, his team, have been instrumental, among others, in working with Majisa Phillip. So in 2014, Majisa was the victim of a violent attack by Montreal police. She was left with a broken arm and criminal charges against her for her attempts to contact police in a context where an acquaintance of hers was in a police car. It is shocking that she had to spend time and energy in order to fight off the charges that were brought against her. She was, of course, acquitted of all the charges against her, with the judge ruling in her favor against all 4 police officers. She also went through an ethics complaint before police commission, but unfortunately lost both the ethics and complaint and the appeal, despite the fact that the evidence clearly showed in the criminal trial and the defense that the evidence simply did not support the charges that were brought against her. Majisa is currently suing the city and those officers for $700,000. And for the last 6 years, she has continued to be a strong advocate in the fight against racial profiling and systemic racism by making her cause public and keeping it in the news. Majisa, we're thrilled to have you here with us. You're very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be a part of something like this, especially after this amount of time that I've been going through this. It was hard for me there's no preparing for this. For me, I'm actually having a lot of anxiety naturally because it's been a long time that I haven't spoken about this publicly. And for me, I'm reliving things, and to know that every day it's still going on for me, knowing that those police officers are still out there working. Like she had said, a judge ruled in my favor against 4 officers, and none of those officers have had any consequences based on what they did. They broke my arm, my humerus, which is one of the strongest bones in your body. They broke it in half, and I have a pin, 6 pins, and a 6-inch scar down my arm for the rest of my life. And I'm still in this battle. So it's a little bit harder for me to talk about sometimes. And I'm really grateful to hear about Joel's situation, that for Joel, that he got that closure. I mean, I know having that ruling doesn't necessarily give you that full sense of closure, but it does make some kind of stance for all of us. And it gives me some hope that my case will be heard and I'll have some justice. 6 years, it's a really long time to go through. I could say at least 7 to 8 court appearances, and not to mention that I am innocent. So having to be put in a situation where I felt like I was a criminal. They treated me like I was one, and I was never. It was all before my trial even happened. I had my fingerprints taken, and I had my mugshot taken. And for me, I'm a dance teacher. I teach children my entire life. And it was a very hard process for me. It affected my life, and it still does, in the sense that I feel judgment. The world is quite racial. So for me, being a Black woman, a lot of the times I'm the only Black teacher at a lot of the schools I work at. And when this happened, it was insane to me that I felt a sense of shame, and I was the victim, but at the same time, I felt like I couldn't be being honest with people, having explained this to children. It was really, really hard. And for me, I had a record. And even though I wasn't guilty, I had a record. It stopped me from being able to get police checks for teaching my students. I had some of my studio owners be like, listen, we know who you are and we're gonna let you keep teaching regardless. But the fact that I was innocent, and my whole life was completely disrupted. And I still have a lot of issues today. I've been kind of sweating all morning, just nervous to talk about it. And I'm really grateful that people are here to hear me out. And, like I said, I can't prepare much for this because I'm still going through it. And the fact that I won my first trial, which should never have even happened. I'm grateful to have had such an amazing lawyer, Arij Riahi. She stood by my side and she supported me through those 3 years. And now I have another amazing lawyer, Max Silverman, who's also just helping me emotionally and legally to get through this. Knowing that this discussion is happening really, truly gives me a sense of hope that things might change. Like I said, hearing what Joel said, knowing that he has that verdict, it really truly inspires me, and I hope it inspires others to follow through. The battle, I have to say, I never thought it would be this long. I never thought it would be this hard. The city is definitely trying to make this longer and more excruciating for me. I've had to go through some psychiatric evaluations that they requested, 5-hour grueling questions, basically trying to say that I'm not suffering, or what I went through isn't valid. And I have to say that I live through it every day. And I don't know if when I get some justice, if I get some justice, that I'll feel better. But at the same time, I know right now in my life, I look over my shoulder. If I hear sirens, I get nervous. And it's just like something that I would never have expected to be still carrying on at this point in the world. My grandmother and my grandfather were a biracial couple, and they married in the 50s. And I'm sure they were thinking, wow, we're making a difference, and the world's going to be better. And it's hard for me sometimes to acknowledge that we're not quite there yet. And the fact that someone just looked at me and deemed me a menace, never spoke to me, didn't give me the time to just to understand who I am. I mean, just to be judged by your race is it's something that you can never fully accept. And my point for me being here is to just share with people like the trauma, and it's not something that, white people might not go through this, and it's not to say that you won't understand, but I know that people of all races are supporting me in this, and it's just hard. And I'm grateful that we're having this discussion, because it really truly moves me, and also just makes me feel supported in a world that is unfortunately black and white. I wish I had more to say, but my nerves are definitely I'm getting emotional. So for everyone else who's going to speak, I'd like to thank everybody again for being willing to have this open discussion. Going public with this was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made in my life, but I have no regrets. And I'm going to power through this and fight until I can't fight anymore. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you very much, Ms. If you don't mind me saying also, the trauma and the impact of this violent police intervention also had on your mother and your grandmother, whom I had the personal pleasure of meeting. 3 generations of people hurt by this incident till today, and I'm very, very sorry that this happened, particularly to your grandmother, the legendary tap dancing queen, Ethel Bruno. If you know a little bit of Black history, you know who she is. And it broke my heart to see that your grandmother in her 80s had to go with us to press conference to publicly denounce this kind of racial injustice she had to go through.
Yeah, she was sitting in a courtroom. She had to sit in a courtroom and watch me be, grilled by a prosecutor, knowing that I'm completely innocent. So I'm definitely grateful for my mother and my grandmother. I'll say this, my mother was actually speaking to me today prior to this, and she reminded me, I had kind of forgot, but she reminded me that the day that I went for my trial in 2017, the city tried to make me an offer asking me to plead guilty and go to anger management. And my mother, being a mother, felt like, how much longer do you want to go through this? Like, Majeza, I've seen it break you down. And she was like, do you want to accept it? And it's one of the first times I really got angry, and I kind of was rude to my mom, but I stood my ground and I said, no, Mom, I have to do this. And she said today, she's like, I am so grateful that you made that decision, because you're fighting the good fight and you're doing it for all of us. So, yeah.
Okay, great. So now with the time that we have, I guess I would invite questions and comments from our participants. I think both Majeza and Joel will be more than glad to address many of the issues that have been raised.
Yes.
Thanks very much, Fo, and thanks to Majeza and to Joel in particular, both of you, for being the voices and the faces of this terrible practice. I think if I may, one of the things that happens when you start the conference with the academic literature and the scholarly literature, which is of course so important and we'll be hearing from the next session, is that it's sometimes easy to forget about or not address the human beings, the human situations, the human experiences that are behind these terrible incidents. So thank you both for having the courage to
Thank you.
speak. Thank you for having the courage to be with us today. Thank you for voice. Thank you for giving voice to your stories, because at the end of the day, this is what we're all here for, and you cannot engage in this discussion without it. So a couple of, we normally are going to be reserving the questions to the end, but we did get some questions in that I'd be very interested in hearing Majiza and Joel response to. One of the questions that several of the questions that come through specifically have to deal with what can be done, what needs to change. And I'd be very interested in getting your thoughts as people who have been through the system and through multiple parts of the system: criminal, human rights, civil actions, ethics, and so on. What, in your view, needs to change?
Well, for me personally, I think a huge level of transparency needs to be like the case for me, knowing that 4 officers, it was ruled against them and they lied and there's no repercussions. It's hard for me to understand a system that works like that, where, you know, different individuals, it's like, if you're not a cop, then you're going to be tried to the fullest extent. But then if you're a cop, you have all these leeways. And I feel like for me, a proper organization that can properly investigate police officers and is taken very seriously, because for me, everything I went through at the police commission, the police ethics, it gives me little faith in knowing that cops can be pursued. So I think proper accountability, like some kind of system, it's so hard to really explain, but just truth, more truth for me.
Yeah, I agree with Majiza on that. There's got to be a heck of a lot more accountability, and the reprimands have to be more severe to these officers, because, you know, getting 5 days off just for insulting somebody because of their appearance is basically a slap on the wrist and throws them back into the field again to do it again to another victim. So there's got to be a lot more accountability from the top. So they have to take responsibility in regards to how they're, you know, the actions of their officers. You know, and for me personally, in regards, you know, because for me it's happened in my vehicle over several occasions. I would like to know, what are those officers actually thinking? What's that split second thought that they're thinking prior to you know, deciding to pull a U-turn, put on their lights, and follow the car? Is it the person in the car that's driving? Is it because the car is flashy? Is it both thoughts that are parallel? So I think if we, you know, manage to figure out what that, I guess, you know, inclination is, then, you know, we'll be able to kind of start to address, you know, what's wrong and why these officers are doing it, and then be able to correct from the top, you know, what those issues are, and hopefully we can put a lid on these issues.
Thanks very much. Sure,
I'd like
please
to
go
add
ahead.
one more thing.
Please.
Also, one thing I experienced going through this, and I've had people reach out to me through Facebook and send me private messages about their own situations they're going through. There isn't enough services accessible for victims, and CRAR is one of the few organizations that I've ever heard of that was able to do this. And I think that one of the main things is that there isn't much help for us. And the people feel very helpless, and I only know so much information to give them. And I feel like the government should be supporting victim services as equally as they support police services. You know, they matter equally, and I don't feel like we get enough support.
Thanks very much to both of you.
Well said.
Thank you.
Fo, the next question is for you. In your opinion, is the collection of race-based data by law enforcement agencies a necessary and worthwhile step towards tackling racial and social profiling in policing?
Definitely, we need the data because we need to prove, we need to substantiate, and we need the empirical evidence in order to back up the claims of disproportionate stop, disproportionate use of force, disproportionate laying of criminal charges, as well as disproportionate, I'm sure in many cases of shall we say, inadequate legal representation. And one of the things I want to say about data is it has to be disaggregated, not only in terms of race, but also gender and age, in order to better make the case. And we have cases right now where basically it's so hard to make the case because we don't have the data. And if we don't have the data, we can't prove disproportionate impact. We can't prove systemic barriers, and we cannot argue a case of systemic racism properly. So we feel that the decision of the Human Rights Tribunal in Joel's case is very, very important. I also want to take this opportunity to mention that in the last almost 10 years, there have only been 4 positive decisions by the Human Rights Tribunal on racial profiling. But there are so many more cases in which basically the tribunal has dismissed claims of racial profiling brought up against it, including some recent cases where the tribunal dismissed racial profiling claims because of excessive delay in the handling of complaints at the Human Rights Commission, one of which involved a woman of color, a client of ours, in which the commission took 88 months to bring the case before the tribunal. So with data, we can also know through the criminal courts and through the civil courts also where cases win or lost.
And Fo, there's a follow-up question that I think is appropriately also directed to you before I get to the next one for Joel and Majiza, which is, how do you respond to the accusation or concern that collecting race-based data is itself discriminatory?
Well, we already have a precedent in this country. It's called the Employment Equity Act, which requires federally regulated employers to collect data based on the representation of women, people of color or visible minorities, people of Indigenous backgrounds, and people with disabilities in all job categories. At the provincial level, we also have the Mandatory Employment Equity Act, in which also employers are required to compile data in employment and representation among the groups of visible minorities. So look, those who are skeptic about the race-based data, I think are a little bit behind the time, because as we know that the train has left the station. So either you jump on a join and move towards the future, or you get stuck in the past.
Thanks very much. And we mentioned briefly the role that human rights commissions have been playing in different aspects, and I'd like to acknowledge the presence among the listening community today of Marie-Claude Landry, the head of the Chief Commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. So this question is for Joel and for Majiza in whatever order you're most comfortable with. What does community safety mean to you? And how might we practice that in a way that may or may not rely on policing?
Good question. I think that, like Majiza had said earlier, possibly, looking for some form of, I guess, outside organization that can, hold the police accountable. So maybe there should be some form of a, community watchdog that is out there to, help, visible minorities to, basically ensure that once they're confronted by the police, that, there's some form of a mediation. Honestly, I think, because I've thought about this question sort of, in my head in the past, that the police do need to be held accountable. There's nobody really watching them when they're on the road doing, these illegal practices of racially profiling people. So there has to be some, form of accountability, maybe cameras on their, on their bodies that would possibly deter them from initiating any of these practices to begin with. But definitely, I believe some form of a body separate from the force, that the force is aware that's there, possibly, in conjunction with the police, and that they know that, Big Brother is watching them, and maybe that will cut down some of the incidents that could turn a lot more grave than what happened to Majiza. I'm fortunate enough that none of that sort has happened to me, but it could very well happen, in the future, and we got to, try and settle that down before it gets worse like that.
Thanks very much, Joel. Geez, anything to add?
Yeah, for me, community safety. I grew up in Little Burgundy, which is a primarily Black Anglo community. So what I saw growing up, what I experienced living there was a beautiful sense of community. And contrary to what's happening now, the police had a very big presence, positive and negative, in my neighborhood. For me growing up, I remember my brother was part of a Taekwondo program, and they would be picked up in a van by police officers, and they would take a bunch of boys to the sports center in the neighborhood to learn self-defense, to learn how to, Taekwondo. And I remember being at festivals in my neighborhood and seeing police officers there. One of them had a pet iguana, I remember, as a kid, and he used to let us pet it. And it was like, I didn't feel intimidated. And then as I got older, I would see situations where I'd see guys I know sitting on a fence, like sitting on a bench or something, and a neighbor or somebody would call the cops, and the cops would not ask questions. They would throw these guys down to the floor and handcuff them and ask questions later, or maybe not even ask questions at all. So I know that when I was younger, I felt safe in my community, but then as I got older, something changed. And I think that, like, I had a lot of like Youth in Motion. There was different organizations in my neighborhood that definitely brought us together and were trying to teach us about our rights and stuff like that. But I felt happier as a child, whereas now the sense of community, whether it be Little Burgundy, I think that it's slowly, separating. I think that not enough communities in the city are banding together and doing enough outreach necessarily to reach all different kinds of people. I think that police are a part of our society for now, maybe forever, but I know that us as a community, separate from the police, definitely have to come together to educate ourselves more, to feel that support, whether it be if you see something happening, see a police officer doing something wrong, there needs to be an opportunity for a citizen to step in and not be fearful of, of getting a charge for obstruction or being, assaulted by a police officer who's also another person making a choice based on whatever it is they're making. So I think for me, community safety, it's about us banding together, all races, even if you stay within your own, just having that sense of community. I think it has been lost, and it's a matter of us banding together, but also implementing new strategies within each community, because every community is different based on race or social status, whatever it may be.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Majiza. Joel, the next one is for you. How would you advise young men who are angry at the system to interact with police so as not to further endanger themselves? What would your advice be to those who are listening?
Number one is to respect them. They are, placed there in a position of authority to, I wouldn't say, rule over us, but meaning, just basically implement their mandate, which is to serve and protect, the citizens of the community. So, looking back at myself when I was, 13, 14, 15, I respected police. I also knew that it was important to, don't steer away from who you are as an individual. Once you're able to recognize who you are as an individual, and that you're, for me, I have a strong, character, and I take pride in that, and it allows me to keep focused. So if you feel that you haven't done anything wrong, don't forget the respect, but also don't forget the respect for yourself. So I think the two sort of actions together will hopefully diffuse a situation where that individual is not put in any harm's way, and the police officer or officers will respect that younger person, and then they can get themselves in a position where they can mandate CRAR and say, look, I had this altercation with the police, I was respectful to them, but my rights were violated as an individual. What are my next steps? Don't try and solve the situation by yourself. Don't become violent. Just you know, think, use your head, and you know, that's a lot more useful than you know, raising your fist or anything else.
The next question is for all three of you, I think, and a very interesting one, and it's the heart of a lot of our discussions today. Do you see bad police officers as being exceptional situations, or do you believe that they're representative of an entire system of racist and unfair policing? Fo, maybe you can start with that one because it really raises a lot of the systemic issues to give your co-panelists some time to think it through.
Well, we try to always look at the particular facts and circumstances of a case and try not to generalize, because when we generalize, we ourselves promote and prejudice form of generalization. So we always look at the individual officer's individual act, but we also take into account at the same time a broader context, the organizational context, the pattern, the systemic aspect. For example, are officers acting out of a policy directive because of, for example, are there bad apples because the system allows this bad apple to continue? And we've had cases to prove it. Agent 728 is an example. So we have to look at it, but we try to look at, differentiate the systemic from the individual, and we take into account both when necessary, but we try not to generalize, because when we ask police officers not to generalize and profile people on the basis of race, we try also to treat police officers as individuals, and many of them are outstanding officers, particularly officers of color. So we, you know, because we believe that we have to start acting on our beliefs and our principles of not generalizing and not promoting a kind of a bias towards everyone.
Absolutely agree with Fo on that. It is actually a two-way street. I know some, you know, good police officers and bad police officers. I think it comes with the territory. You know, there's some people, some, you know, bad apple officers that, you know, if they were in another type of employment, they, you know, they would get reprimanded or fired in you know, whatever else they were doing. They just happened to choose a career of being a police officer. So you can't actually, you know, change the person. If they were brought up, you know, as how they were brought up, thinking, you know, that this is okay to racially profile people, you're not gonna, you know, you can take the wild out of the animal, but you can't take the animal out of the wild, right? So, and that's the sort of thing that needs to be addressed here. But again, the responsibility, I personally think, in my opinion, wholeheartedly, that the responsibility is from the top, because they hired them. They were supposed to do the background check on them, you know, and find out everything. The officer is just doing what his job is paying him to do, which is to, you know, look and try and, you know, regulate what's going on in you know, on traffic in the street and society as itself. However, again, the responsibility falls on, you know, to the employer. You know, if you do something wrong, you should be fired. Don't you know, put it off to another body where they're supposed to, you know, help them. It should be by the force itself to reprimand the officer. So I can't, you know, just to cut it a bit short. I used to cut hair about 20, 30 years ago as a barber. And a lot of the officers from John Abbott College in St. Anne de Bellevue, where I had my shop, they would all come to see me. Some of them are lieutenants and sergeant right now. And I still know them, haven't talked to them in ages. But I used to cut their hair, and I saw the transition from when they were patrolling the streets as police cadets. You know, they were talking to everybody. They weren't, you know, discriminating against anybody. They were just, you know, doing their job. And they transitioned into police officers. They graduated from Nicolette. And, you know, they were fine. And I'm sure if I bumped into them today, that, you know, they would, you know, have no issue with me in regards, because I always, you know, treated them with respect. So yes, there's good and there's bad. The bad, I don't know why they're bad, but they just happen to wear a badge and be bad at the same time. So, you know, again, I don't know if there's much changing in that.
Well, so from my experience, I saw 4 police officers get on the stand and tell a different story. Each individual person tell a different account of what happened. So I know that what I've seen is bad cops. There might be a good one amongst them, but he doesn't have the opportunity to be that good cop because police officers are kind of a gang, if you will. And I think that, you know, the same way blacks support blacks, police officers support police officers. One good cop amongst 4, he could try to make a difference, but the odds are he's going to get transferred, lose his job. So I think that it's 100% a systemic thing. I think that there's plenty of good cops out there, but I don't think they have the opportunity to be the good person, the good cop they want to be. They're good people, but they're still doing a job. And based on that system, they have to do it a certain way, which means they can see another police officer do something very illegal. And chances are there's not much they can do about it. So in my experience, you know, it's hard to say good cop, bad cop, because they're all together and they all have to follow a certain code of whatever that code is. So that's my opinion.
Thank you. I think we're done with our time, but we've gotten 2 quick comments in that I wanted to leave you with. Majiza, one of the questions that's come up is, how do we help you in your current fight with the City of Montreal, and what's the best way to bring awareness and contribute to your getting the justice you need? And that's not something you can answer in 1 minute or in an hour, obviously, but we are going to be having some follow-up spaces in the website around the questions that have come up. And I'd like us to connect to see ways in which you can be supported in the fight that you've been handling for so many years. And I'm going to invite everyone who's listening to this to give that some thought as well, because we are here in solidarity with you.
Thank you.
And in closing, for all of you, one person wrote in to say, as a Black woman who experiences racism every single day, this means a lot to me. I am overwhelmed. These people validate my feelings. Thank you for organizing this. So thank you all for your voice and for your presence today.